All right, here we go. Today is Sunday, November 17th, 2019, and this is episode 240 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry. How are you, sir?
So good it hurts. How are you?
About the same. I'm feeling great, feeling strong, and my final reassembly surgery, where they're going to go in and put all the Lego pieces back together, is coming up very soon. And then I can put this weird year behind me.
Awesome. It's kind of like been you need a mulligan, I guess, right?
Seriously. I mentioned on Twitter a couple of weeks ago that I'm pretty much an introvert. But I found that about 7 months of medically induced hermitage, I think that's a word, of being a hermit, is my limit. I'm now probably going to be obnoxiously social in 2020.
All right. Well, I look forward to seeing how that works out.
But otherwise, everything's good, and I'm just cruising along, looking forward to getting this final surgery done, getting recovered from that, and in theory, being back to normal, fully recovered, they tell me. That's
great. That is great news. So let's see. Just a thank you to all of our Patreon donors.
Absolutely. You guys are awesome.
Sincerely appreciate you. If you do like the show, please give us some love on iTunes or your favorite podcast website, which we should be on most of them now. Let's see. I'm not even going to talk about, opinions and whatnot. You all get that. So, hey, let's jump into some stories.
Since you skipped our disclaimer, this is the show that will get us sued. Excellent. Move on.
As if that disclaimer is going to help us. Yeah.
Fair.
All right. So the first story we have tonight comes from Ars Technica, and the title is "Breach Affecting 1 Million Was Caught Only After Hacker Maxed Out Target Storage." Yeah. So this is an incident involving a company called Infotrex Systems, and it came to light because the Federal Trade Commission here in the U.S. filed a formal complaint against them, and they in this complaint identified that between 2014 and 2016, some adversary accessed their network and systems 17 times before a final 3 times where they actually did start stealing actual data. And the only way or only reason that the breach came to light was, as the headline kind of alludes to, the adversary was not very careful, and in the process of compiling all of the data for exfiltration ended up filling up the hard drive on a server, which became a noticeable availability problem that the company investigated, and then it kind of all unwound. So interesting.
It is, and in some ways, it almost buries the lead, because something that I found interesting was the FTC is suing them,
right,
which we've not seen a lot. And so then it starts to become interesting in my mind. What level of due diligence is something like the FTC looking for a company to have done reasonable enough security that they're not going to get sued when they get breached? Because I think it's somewhat fair to say that even the companies with the best security-ish can get breached. So at some point, you can look at a breach like somebody smashing through the front door of your business. You did what you could. You locked the door and they still smashed in. Okay, that's not necessarily the owner's fault. But where it is their fault is, they leave the door unlocked, they leave valuables out, that kind of thing. Then you start to blame the owner a little bit. So I'm kind of curious, if the FTC is suing this company, clearly they feel the company did a poor job at security. And are we now going to get to a point where the FTC or some other government organization is sort of defining minimum viable security, which seems like an incredibly difficult thing to do for millions of different organizations. I don't know where this is going to go, and is this something that we're going to regret long term? That when there's things that aren't, I know a lot of people say, hey, hold them accountable, blame them, but we have seen over and over and over and over and over again, this is a really complex problem, and we suck at solving it. So it's not just a matter of do your job better. There's more to it than that.
Yeah, so over the years, the FTC has sued a number of different companies, including a couple of notable cases where the target of the lawsuit actually ended up going out of business. I think, was it LabCorp? It was something like that. It may not be.
Yeah, that's a really infamous case that's still ongoing.
So, in one go ahead.
Well, yeah, and there's actually a whole book about that. The Devil in the Beltway, I think, is the name of it. And it's actually an Atlanta-based company too. I met the guy who ran it, oddly enough, at an aviation event. But that one's weird because he was the victim in many ways. And kind of got sued into oblivion by the FTC, and that's still an ongoing case. But that's a whole different kind of ball of wax.
So that case and a number of others has, caused a lot of criticism to be directed at the FTC because there's no safe harbor. There's no kind of objective criteria that if you follow and you still get breached, that you're guaranteed that the FTC wouldn't come after you, and this is kind of still is the case. And intuitively, there seems to be some kind of threshold beyond which the FTC feels like they have to take action. And I think where a lot of people are consternating is we don't really know where that threshold is, and nor do we actually know if that threshold is kind of constant. When you read the complaint against InfoTrax, it's kind of hard to feel super bad about them because it seems like they were storing data that they didn't need, and they just didn't have kind of a lot of the basic controls in place. But at some level, there's it's kind of tautological that if you end up having a breach or are the subject of a breach, something went wrong, which means that your controls somehow in some way were deficient or not functioning correctly. And so therefore you can imagine that,
Okay, but let's play that out. Let's say a vulnerability comes out that's on your externally facing web app and it's being actively exploited.
Mm-hmm.
And day 1 it comes out, day 7 you're exploited, you would have patched it by day 14.
Right.
So what's the threshold? Is 14 days fast enough for a sophisticated public-facing e-commerce website that you are very concerned about downtime and customer friction, or is 7 days fast enough, or is 30 minutes fast? Where is the balance between business and risk that could be enforced? Yeah. And that's where it gets so fuzzy.
I think that from the perspective of regulators and plaintiffs' lawyers, it only matters that the breach happens. It doesn't, if it happens, you waited too long, right? Whether that was 30 minutes or 7 days.
But that's just not realistic. I mean, it's like, if you take it back out to the physical world, you're a taxi company, you're Uber, you're going to have auto vehicle accidents,
mm-hmm.
right? They're terrible. People might die. You don't want them to happen. But we have normalized that risk. We've accepted that risk will occur. In this case, it seems like the FTC is saying, I don't want to put words in the mouth, but we are at risk of saying no breach might ever occur, or we're going to deeply punish your business to potentially put it out of business. And that doesn't seem viable. If you're online and you're running any sort of IT-centric business, there will be risk. It's unavoidable. And that risk, at some point, somebody's going to roll the hard 6, and you're going to lose, and somebody's going to exploit you.
Well, it's certainly fair, although I'm not sure we have completely normalized the car incident. I mean, you get tickets. Sometimes you go to jail for reckless driving, or
that's true.
And it also doesn't stop you from being sued by. Look, drive around any city, and you'll see plenty of billboards advertising lawyers willing to, take your case to recover money from your neck injury.
Yeah, right? That's true.
So
that's true. Although normally to play that out even more, insurance often covers that. But
yeah,
you're not wrong.
Fair enough.
Maybe we're just still very young in this problem, and we haven't figured out the right balance. I know this is not even the point of the story.
No, but it is the point of the story. To be candid, I think it is. From one of the interesting things about this to me is it points out the kind of inextricable link between security and law and regulation, and I think sometimes we get in the security field we lose that. We lose that linkage, we lose that context, and to some extent, it's going to be different for each individual company who has different risk appetites. But I think this points out that there is a legal component. I mean, not just an honor, it's the honorable thing to do to protect the data. It's also, a legal issue. And in some cases, it's more prominent than in others because I have like the GDPR now, and we've had HIPAA for quite some time, and there's a bunch of new regulations like the CCPA in California and the LGPD down in Brazil, and lots more on the way. But in this particular case, this as far as I can tell, kind of evaded any one of those other regulations, and so the FTC, kind of sees this as their call to action, where there's no other regulation to get them.
That's fair, and to be clear, I'm not saying that there should be consequence-free outcomes for these breaches. I'm just trying to understand, how do we as businesses know what appropriate due diligence is to avoid, at least the minimum level of punishment coming from these various government entities. You look at like PCI, for instance, it's we have a story on this. It's very prescriptive. And that at least gives a business a target. Now, again, compliance is not security. Let me be clear. But at least gives clear guidance. And this is what, I'm a little frustrated about in things like this, is that how do you give such a complex topic like this clear guidance? I don't think we know yet. I think it's on a case-by-case, very subjective nature, which has got to drive certain executives crazy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said, this is an area where I think lots of companies struggle, especially with the FTC, because there is no firm guidance. And by the way, it's also interesting when you look at some of the other laws, again, like the GDPR. While it's a very long and meandering regulation, it also doesn't have clear guidance either. And so that itself is this is a pervasive problem. And so I think what we see is companies.
I think with the GDPR, the problem is translating it from the original Latin. We lose a lot in English, I think, is the problem.
Well, that's actually, I think it was in Aramaic first, wasn't it?
Was it?
Then it was into Latin, and then.
Wasn't it in Greek for a while? Ancient Greek?
Probably.
Yeah.
So anyway, what we see, I think, a lot of, at least I see in GDPR land, and I think we're starting to see it in some of these other regulations, and maybe it's a partial answer for this is companies aligning themselves with what they perceive as industry best practices, whether it's ISO 27000 or NIST or COBIT or something like that, where they can go back to a regulator and say, look, we obviously something went wrong, right? But we tried very hard, and here's what we have done. We followed this industry standard program, and so I think that's what really all we have to go on in general. That's kind of what I'm seeing out in the wild right now.
Yeah, that makes some sense. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out, and if and how we ever get to something more predictable. Which
is good because, as we all know, if you have your ISO 27000 attestation, hackers aren't really allowed to target you anymore. They have to move on. They have to go find some other target. So
absolutely, it's kind of like your food safety inspection sign you put up on the wall.
Correct. Yeah, the elevator certificate. Right.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And when is your new book on 27,000 certification passing coming out? As clearly you're pimping it.
Clearly, no. You just gave me an idea. I got to go work on that now. All right, moving on to our next story. This one comes from CSO Online, and the title is "What You Need to Know About the New OWASP API Security Top 10 List." I thought this was worth talking about because it's kind of a new spin on an old concept. We're all familiar with the OWASP Top 10, which has historically been focused on web application vulnerabilities, but they've since expanded, right? Not really expanded, but created a new similar type of concept focused on API security. And they point out here in the article that under our noses, APIs have become really, really pervasive. According to Akamai, which claims that 83%, an Akamai report claims that 83% of all web traffic is actually API calls. So that's pretty significant. By 2021, APIs will account for 90%.
Do you think that's being driven by mobile?
Almost certainly. Heavily so, I think. Yes.
Yeah, that was my take.
Yeah. Now, I also suspect it depends on how you count, right? Because obviously API traffic is not the same as like streaming Netflix videos or pornography. So if you measure it by raw bandwidth, I bet you API calls are not. But if you were to probably think about things in transaction terms, I bet it is APIs.
So now we know what consumes the majority of bandwidth in your household.
Actually, I have I moved over to Ubiquiti Network Gear, and so it kind of shows you some interesting pie charts, and the one pie chart is like 75% PlayStation games. so yeah, I guess that could be.
As a random aside, I just switched online cloud backup vendors, which means I had to do a full backup again.
Oh yeah.
I started getting nasty grams from my ISP that I was exceeding my bandwidth limitation for the month. I was like, oh, I forgot about that.
Yeah, I have teenagers, so I had to opt for the unlimited bandwidth, which is probably our non-US listeners are probably like, what the hell is that?
We live in the dark ages.
Yes. Comcast makes it really, really easy to get to your limit super fast. And then they charge you. So anyway, back on point here. One of the objectives of this is to call attention to the common misconfigurations and issues with APIs, and they point out that there's been a number of high-profile breaches over the past couple of years, many of which we've actually talked about, like Panera Bread and more recently Capital One. Although Capital One is kind of a they clearly put the Capital One breach into the into scope for this discussion, but that one is hard to. That was a really edge case, I think. I'm not.
Yeah,
not,
I would
not,
agree.
Not that it is an uncommon problem, but it was difficult to say it's like an API issue.
Right, an API call was involved, but it was not the fault or the cause.
Correct. I mean, right. It kind of assumes, or I should say, it kind of implies that the API provider, which was Amazon, had some weakness, and that's really not.
That's case. Like saying that an exploit said over HTTPS that HTTPS is at fault. No, not really.
There you go. So anyway, they have a list of 10 top 10 issues. There are some criticisms levied against the top 10 in this article, which is I was summarized by saying, well, this whole API thing is really complicated, and geez, it would be really nice if we actually had prescriptive guidance, which is the perennial issue with these kinds of things, So yes, the top 10 are kind of high level, but it's with everything else. They don't provide enough guidance by themselves to take action with. But it does point out that as time goes on, we need to bake this into our development program. I actually think this is more of a IT and development issue than it is necessarily an IT security issue.
Well, it comes down to educating your developers about these issues.
Correct.
And getting them to care.
Right. But they point out that, it is really difficult to actually test for these kinds of problems. That, you can't run a vulnerability scanner and find many of these API issues. You can't, they point out the problems with static and dynamic testing. And so it really is one of these cases where you are best served in having having these things developed correctly in the first place. And they actually also point out that unlike many other human interface type technologies, when you are creating APIs and you release an API and then you later find that there's some fundamental issue that has to be fixed, is really painful because you've got an ecosystem typically that's sprung up around the consumption of that API. Now everything that relies on it conceivably has to also be changed, and so it's not just fixing your web app behind the scenes that nobody notices.
We've had guidance for years that fixing a security problem in development is much cheaper than fixing it in production.
Sure.
But that hasn't necessarily resonated much in terms of getting developers to become educated and being allowed to focus on it. So it's the old story all over again. The sooner you can catch a bug, the cheaper.
Yeah.
The other thing I'm thinking about is, so your various static and dynamic code testing suites will probably start adding support for these top 10, but who knows how effective those tests will be, given the nature of APIs. So there could end up with a false sense of security if, you run whatever your favorite web application code testing tool is, and they're like, oh yeah, you're fine. Be careful.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, moving on to our next story. This one comes from Security Week, and the title is PCI DSS Compliance Between Audits is Declining, according to Verizon. So Verizon recently released this new report. It's titled Verizon 2019 Payment Security Report. It's actually a really interesting read, although it's 90 pages long. So there's no way I can do it justice in just a couple of minutes here. But I actually think this is, number one, the concepts that they discuss in this report are very useful far beyond just PCI. That a lot of the report talks about fundamental IT security governance and whatnot. Yeah, there's lots of discussion about PCI, and as you can tell by the title, one of the main findings they're pointing out is that after a PCI audit, as we've talked about in the past, when a company gets a PCI compliant company gets breached, a QSA, it's not actually QSA, I forget the acronym. An auditor comes out and evaluates them, and Verizon is pointing out that when they come in and do those investigations, they found that no company, which was previously assessed to be PCI compliant, was actually PCI compliant at the time, and so by implication, the compliance in quotes of that organization went off a cliff after the PCI audit. Now, I have a fundamental issue in concept with that, with that quote. Although I will say it's discussed in the article, the Security Week article, more than it is in the actual report. But in concept, if you think about what we know about data breaches, is they typically take a long time to materialize. I mean, in the case of the one we talked about earlier, it was like 2 years. And we know from other data breach reports it takes, 6 to 18 months.
When you say materialize, you mean be discovered?
Yes.
Okay, not actually occur, but be discovered.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So from the time the intrusion until the time that it's recognized, it can take a long time, which probably spans a PCI audit. So quite likely, in I don't know exactly how many cases would be like this, but almost certainly there are regularly QSA audits for PCI DSS that assert compliance for an organization who's actively being breached, which is fascinating to think about.
Well, without giving away any confidential information, my experience, having worked for a number of different PCI-regulated businesses, is that whenever, depending on what level of PCI you're being audited at, it is a mad scramble to fix the problems when PC auditors are coming around, or, frankly, to hide those problems. And it's been very clear to me, and that this is what this article absolutely echoes, we don't do our day-to-day business with PCI in mind. It might be somewhere in the back of our head, and when I say we, I mean the entire IT organization. And then it's up to the security guys to go find those PCI violations and then beg, borrow, and steal to get them fixed. So, and I think that's what this article is summarizing. We can't look at it as an annual or quarterly activity. It's got to be day by day built into our thinking. And it's not. It just isn't. For most companies I've interacted with who have dealt with these types of things. So it doesn't surprise me at all that even if they were 100% PCI compliant, weren't hiding anything, weren't playing any shenanigans, didn't do the kabuki dance with the auditor, that a month later, enough stuff has changed in the environment that they're no longer PCI compliant. And I think that's probably the state of affairs for most companies. And it's not, the term is continuous compliance that I've heard is one example of this methodology of keeping yourself up to compliance standards all the time. It's either really hard or not of interest to a lot of the rest of the IT organization. And we've now trained our environments that we've got this annual mad scramble, and then we don't have to worry about it in many cases.
Yeah, it's the whole concept of teaching for the test, right? It's you're just myopically focused on passing the audit. They do point out to the credit of the authors of this report, they point out that there's really three likely possibilities of why this happens. One was, that they were actually compliant at the time of the audit, but they did regress after, like you just described. Another possibility is that the assessor missed some non-compliance, which is not hard to think that that's likely to be the case. In most IT environments are fairly complex, and it's not not really possible, I don't think, to test for everything.
Or the auditor was bamboozled.
Yeah, and then that's the third one, is that the assessor didn't get a full, what they said, they didn't get a full disclosure from the company. And
yeah, I mean, especially for a large complex company, typically what I have seen, and that's all lots of grains of salt applied to this, they ask for a sample, a randomized sample of a control that they're testing against. And it's very possible that randomized sample is compliant, whereas things that were not included in that randomized sample are not.
Right.
And they can't test everything. It's just not viable. So there's a whole lot of ways PCI violation can slip through the cracks.
Yeah, fair enough. So Verizon is Verizon's view at some point in this article, or in the report, I should say, is Verizon's view that if an organization is actually fully compliant with all of the PCI requirements, that they very likely would always avoid or sufficiently early enough identify attacks sufficient to prevent them from actually occurring, which is probably true because, I mean, when you think about it, there's the scope of PCI is pretty broad, and then it has a risk assessment requirement, which you could argue, well, that should catch anything that the other requirements don't identify. So now it occurred to me, and I compare and contrast this against something that I have a lot of experience with, which is bank regulators. And what my observation of bank regulators are that they are less focused on what PCI is doing, where they're actually in the weeds testing. What bank regulators are looking for, again, this is just Jerry's experience, is the management of the company and ensuring that the management system that's in place is sufficient to ensure that, as you talked about, the continuous compliance program is functional. That's what they're really out there looking, because from their perspective, they're only in place, or they're only looking at an organization at a snapshot in time, and then they go away for some period of time, and it's up to the company, and which I think is kind of the point of this article. It's up to the company to continue running things in a secure fashion, and that is, I think, the Achilles heel of the PCI program, is that it's not really focused on driving changes from a management perspective. It's trying to drive changes from a technical and an actual environmental standpoint. So I think if I were to give the PCI crowd or governance committee some suggestions, it would be to focus more on management and a little bit less on the technical compliance.
Yeah, I would counter that, though. The nice thing about PCI is it is very prescriptive, and that gives very clear guidance for a lot of the organization, what they need to do. I think where organizations are falling down is they're not taking this technical guidance and building that program on top of it that management needs to manage. And
fair.
That's something that, the regulator, the PCI teams, organizations could push that. But I think a wise organization would learn that on their own. I mean, another example I can think of is when a company scrambles to get PCI compliant before the audit or during the audit, it's really disruptive. But if they were compliant from the beginning, it wouldn't be.
Right.
So there's downtime. There's all these sort of things that are just, we don't learn from our mistakes. We just keep kicking the mule and wonder why it kicks back.
Yeah, fair enough. If it in order for it to be really effective, it has to be baked into the fabric of your operations. It can't be an adjunct. This is not a different discussion than you had a couple of minutes ago, where it has to be baked in. Can't be tried to bolt on, which is, look, that concept has been thrown around since I first got into security 20 years ago. So I suspect in 20 years we'll still be talking about, we should be baking security in. So
flogging the deceased equine, as it were.
Yes. All right. So the last story comes from Krebs on Security, and this one is fascinating to me as a data type nerd type person.
I thought it was because you were a serial killer, but okay.
Well, title is Study Ransomware Data Breaches at Hospitals Tied to Uptick in Fatal Heart Attacks. So you can kind of...
Now, to be clear, this is not heart attacks within the IT security team.
Correct. When I first saw that headline, that was honestly what I was thinking, to be candid. Having worked in that, not in the health field, right, but just in data breaches in general are quite stressful. So it's pretty interesting that there's a group at Vanderbilt University that looked at some data and that was publicly available through the Health and Human Services. One was related to patient care and outcomes. So they looked at two specific relatively readily available data points. One was the time to from entry into an emergency room and with a complaint of heart problems until the time that an ECG or electrocardiogram was delivered. And then the other is the 30-day mortality rate of certain types of heart attacks. And so they compared that against, they looked at that against a population of hospitals that had a data breach / ransomware incident and those that did not. And, it's an interesting academic report, but at the end of the day, they do find a very minor correlation between hospitals that had a ransomware data breach and reduced patient outcomes or reduced patient care. In the case of the mortality rate, they say it's about a 0.23 to 0.36% increase in fatalities over 30 days, which is not a huge number. It's 23 people out of 10,000, which is, that's still,
Hey, if you're one of those 23, it matters.
Absolutely. I say it that way because it's on the edge of statistical relevance. That's why I say it that way. Not because those 23 people don't matter. Obviously, even one person is too many. But it is difficult once you start getting into that small of a number. And then from a delay to delivering echocardiograms, they found a 1.4 minute to 2.7 minute delay. And now, why does this happen? Well, it's actually because is hypothesized by this group here that in the aftermath of a data breach, what happens, right? We issue the letter that says, well, we take your data security and privacy very seriously. And in the aftermath of those data breaches, organizations go on a mad scramble to implement new security controls, typically. And so the hypothesis of these researchers is that hospitals are no different in that particular case. And they actually have a quote in here, which I don't know is fully supported by the data, but this is a quote out of the report. Enhanced security measures in response to a data breach are likely to worsen the usability of the health IT system, which not only diminishes the effectiveness of its intended function, but also spawns new errors that worsen the quality of care provided to patients. Installation of new health IT requires clinicians and staff to learn new processes, procedures, and ways to coordinate their workflow. And so, the point of this is, and again, the report kind of meanders, and they talk about how, in the immediate aftermath of a data breach, when the hospitals put in new security controls, there's they believe a period of time where the clinicians and doctors and nurses try to work around the new controls, and that creates other problems because now you can't.
Well, and they have every moral authority in their mind to do so. They're saving lives.
Absolutely.
And these damn security people are getting in the way of saving a life.
Absolutely.
And I'm not saying that ironically. I'm not trying to make a joke. So you can see that they're what's the word I want to use here is, their reward system, what they're trying to do is the most important thing, more so than anything else in their world.
Yeah, the data breach, the data breach outcome in their mind is secondary. Like, I think, I assume the average doctor would rather have a data breach than lose a patient.
Sure. So it makes for a really interesting balance of priorities. And I've never worked in the healthcare environment. We have a good friend who does. I won't call him out because he's probably screaming at his podcast player right now. And, I'm sure he deals with this every single day. And it's really, really, really challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But, so if we expand this out a bit, I was thinking about this. Lots of companies and organizations in many different industries have these issues. I mean, the city of Atlanta, where we live, or near where we live, is a great example. We had a pretty massive ransomware outbreak. I guess it was last year now. Feels like it was forever ago, but and there's lots of public hoopla about the amount of money that it costs. I don't remember the last tally. I think it was like $18 million. But a lot of that cost was implementing new controls. It wasn't, that it was $18 million in damages. It was that, we had lots of what I would assume to be pet projects that were on the shelf suddenly funded, things that had been, security controls that had not received, not seen the light of day. There's suddenly an appetite to go and do that. And so I have a strong suspicion that, it's not just a problem in healthcare. Obviously in healthcare, the downside, is measured in lives, right? Whereas probably most other organizations, it's measured in employee dissatisfaction and reduced, efficiency and
I would take it one step further too, that even for those who it wasn't a fatal event, malpractice, lifelong disability.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know what other outcomes could have been negatively impacted.
That's a very good point, right? Yeah, so it could be, I think...
As someone who's going to get surgery in a couple of weeks, now I'm scared crapless. Look what you've done.
Yeah, well, I'm
just going to walk in and unplug their internet connection before they start.
Just ask them if they've had a data breach recently. That's all you need to do.
Excuse me, anesthesiologist, before you put me to sleep.
Well, you got to send them the vendor questionnaire, right?
Right, I was going to say, can you fill out the spreadsheet?
Send them the spreadsheet. That's what you have to do. I mean, it's very simple.
If I don't make it, this conversation is going to come back to haunt you.
Well, that could be. But you know what? It was interesting in the in this study. They point out that with respect to this certain type of heart condition, the mortality, the 30-day mortality rate on a yearly basis has been going down like 0.4% per year, and that effectively when a hospital has a data breach, it undoes that, right? So it negates the year-over-year improvement in outcomes.
Did they say how long that effect lasts? A month, 6 months, a year?
Well, so they've multiple years basically.
Wow.
Yeah, and the disadvantage here is that they only considered a data set from, I think it was 2012 to 2017, and because that was really only data that they had available. So I don't know that we have a good line of sight on, we
need more studies is what it comes down to.
Yeah, more studies in longer time horizons to look at that, because I mean if you go back, hospitals, I suspect, didn't wrestle with ransomware infections in the 2000s, the early 2000s. It probably was just a very rare.
I mean, their leech management systems weren't online at that time.
Correct. That's true. Yeah, the bloodletting and all that was still being done very manually, not automated yet. That's very true.
It is quite interesting to see the pneumatic pipes that they ship the leeches around in these days. It's quite something.
Well, I mean, they don't want to touch them, so yeah.
And certain leeches get a reputation as being better than others.
Right.
And they kind of level up, and then you get the stars that are put on the head of the good leeches.
The rock star, yeah.
Right.
Rock star leeches, yeah.
But, it also makes me think, okay, does there come a point, because clearly advancing the technology aids in the outcome is probably a safe assumption. In other words, using newer technology, better technology, allows the clinicians, the doctors, the nurses, whomever, better outcome for their patients. But are we going about it wrong? In other words, should they be more isolated somehow, or somehow more resilient to these environments? I don't even know how to do that, right? But it's one of those things of, where does the technology advance become a value of diminishing returns because of these sorts of incidents? And I have no idea. But it seems like an area ripe for research and ripe for study.
Yeah, I think that's right. My intuition is that we're not close to that threshold. We're not close to that inflection point, and so there's probably still lots of upside to to improvements derived from technology. I mean, look, we're just now at the cusp of really starting to use things like machine learning, for helping to diagnose ailments and whatnot. And over time that's going to continue on. But one of the fundamental things that's predicated on is having data, right? That knowing the history of the patient and having all that stuff be readily available and consumable. And anyway, I think the point of this study was to help maybe drive some behavioral changes in organizations like Health and Human Services, who, I mean, they have this thing that's, it's informally called the wall of shame, right? Which is where organizations that have had a HIPAA data breach, they get their name and information about the data breach posted on this wall of shame. And I think the point is, this may, it kind of like in the wake of September 11th, when people stopped flying, there's a pretty well accepted, although somewhat statistically questionable concept that lots more people died from increased car crashes because people weren't driving. They were driving a lot, or they weren't flying. They were driving significantly more than they were flying, and the fatality rate of driving is just orders of magnitude higher than it is if you're flying commercially. It's a similar kind of concern here, that if we are we driving the wrong incentive? I mean, obviously we don't want data breaches, but is that the mandate to reduce those data breaches coming at the cost, the unintended cost of reduced patient care? Again, totally not my area, but it's fascinating to think about.
Yeah, I agree. It's you're right, and just to be clear, not my area either, but we'll talk about it anyway, like it is, because
Yeah.
the value of the advice in the show is worth exactly what you pay for it.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. But it's an interesting thing to think about in the abstract. This concept is, I think, again, most acute in healthcare because it's measured in lives. But I suspect the concept exists everywhere. And so the point, I think, is that in the aftermath of a data breach, we need to make sure that we're not cutting our nose off, to spite our face. Certainly, data breaches are wake-up calls for organizations.
Well, yeah, I agree, and certainly I don't mean this in any political sense, but I was watching this. It might have been a news report the other day about school shootings and how teachers are now being given gunshot wound trauma kits and training on how to use them. And I thought, well, that's interesting. But then, as an engineer and a cold-hearted bastard, my next thought was, what's the most likely way for a student to die in the care of a teacher? And I don't know what the stats are, but I know that a school shooting is really low on that list. And then I'm wondering, okay, what are we doing to address those other, choking at lunch or anaphylactic shock or, injuries in some other way? And I'm wondering, again, are we reacting to emotion and not statistics if our goal is truly to save lives? And I don't know. I really don't know because I don't have the research and the stats. But I was like, wow, we have a finite amount of energy and a finite amount of resources and a finite amount of money. And I often see us in the InfoSec world, just like the rest of the world, reacting out of emotion because something got press or something has a fancy, name and a mascot and a theme song, and it's a popular zero day, when we divert our resources to go fight that when it's not our biggest threat. And so I'm just kind of jumping off this topic a little bit, but I think these studies are important because although it's terrible to abstract life and death away into statistics, if your goal is to reduce death, these things matter. For instance, self-driving cars, they're not perfect, but we have something like 35,000 deaths a year on American roads from driving. If we could drop that by 10,000, even though self-driving cars caused, let's say, 1,000, but we reduced by 10,000, is that a net gain we want as society? Is that helpful? I mean, it seems sometimes like when we look at these new technologies, we're looking for a perfect solution rather than an incremental improvement. Mm-hmm. And incremental improvements is how things have always gone in life. It's how we've always done things. And now we're so focused on the negative of something, we're not willing to accept it for the incremental improvement. It seems like. I don't know where I'm going with this, but ultimately we've got to stop reacting out of emotion and fear and start reacting out of, statistics, logic, and, moving the ball forward.
Yeah. So a couple things. One is I'm personally frustrated by the trolley problem continuing to pop up in the context of self-driving cars.
Because you want to kill all of them and you can't figure out a way.
There was there's some interesting cartoons about about the trolley problem. Like, if we stop the train now, what about all the people the train ran over before? Now they died in vain.
As a quick aside, if you're not a fan of The Good Place, one, you should be. It's a phenomenal show. Two, they had a great episode about the trolley problem, and it's worth watching.
Okay, I've not seen that, but
really, you would love it.
No.
I really, really do think you would.
So, but yeah, we consternate over what would the car do? If it was faced with running over a kid versus an adult, what would the car do? But we lose the context that, one of the innate abilities of the car is to avoid that situation in a much a higher proportion of instances than a human driver could, and therefore, it's lots less opportunity for that. But there's a interesting book. I forget the name. Oh, it's Risk Savvy. That's what the name of the book is. Risk Savvy. It's by a guy named Gerd Gigerenzer, I think is how you say his name, and he calls this dread risk. So this is the fear of flying. It's the fear. He defines that. I forget the exact definition he gives, but it's basically the high profile risks, the things that you get on you see on TV. There's lots of people. I have some friends who are who are quite afraid of walking alone at night, or having their kids go to a park, and the reason is that if you were to watch the news, right, you would get the feeling that people are dying all the time on airplanes, people are being kidnapped off of playgrounds all the time, people are being raped, murdered, and whatnot all the time, and obviously all those things happen far, far too often. But the issue is that they're on the news because they are news.
Yeah, what's the statistical likelihood of you encountering that in your world on any given day?
Right.
Yeah, it's terrible when it happens. But if this is, again, this is cold, dispassionate discussion, but it's something that we suck at. And again, I think the news drives it, but the news is a reflection of what we care about as society. I'm not blaming the news. I'm blaming society. Mm-hmm. And again, not to get into politics at all, but Freakonomics had a really good chapter on this about perceived risk. And the question, and I won't get this right, so take it with a grain of salt, was to parents of young children. And they said, would you let your young child go play at the house across the street if you knew they had a gun? Versus if you knew they had a swimming pool. And far more said, no, I wouldn't let them go if I knew they had a gun than if I knew they had a swimming pool. However, statistically, the swimming pool was far more likely to kill the kid than the gun. And I'm not getting anywhere near the gun control debate. I'm purely looking at we measure risk poorly because of all sorts of reasons. When the swimming pool is really the much higher percentage chance of their child being harmed or dying. But we suck at measuring that and internalizing that and reacting to that. And then I think this is a similar thing. We have these innate fears that are outsized risks. And I don't have the statistics in front of me, but the chances of being harmed or killed in a terrorist incident are infinitesimally small in the United States. But we react more to that than we do to things that will more likely statistically kill us, like
cancer,
heart
diabetes,
disease,
heart disease, car crashes,
suicide, car crashes. And I think it's, again, I don't have the right words to articulate this as well as a lot of these authors and researchers, but to me, it's like we've normalized those risks. We've accepted them. And we have not, and we outsize reaction to other risks. And it's just a weird thing. And, emotion drives a lot of behavior that is illogical, but we're illogical creatures. So I'll get off my soapbox.
All right. Anyhow, thanks again, everyone. Have a great week, and we'll talk again soon.
See you. Bye-bye.
See ya.